Story 1. This story is told from the perspective of a female. Me and my husband are both first-generation Americans. Both of our families originate from mainland China. I went back to China 4 years ago to visit my grandparents that still live in Shandong province, and I took my son, who was 2 years old at the time, with me. My husband was too busy with work stuff, so I ended up going without him. So it was only my son and I traveling. The trip was a very long one that involved flying from California to Shanghai, and then from Shanghai to Beijing, and then a train from Beijing to my grandparents' house. The longest part of the flight was from California to Shanghai, and it went by without a hiccup. My son slept for most of the flight, and it was a smooth ride, with some great movies to choose from that helped the time go by quicker. When we arrived at Shanghai Airport, we had to change planes for our domestic flight to Beijing. It took us a while because Shanghai is such a monster airport, but we eventually found our onward flight. We checked in and we boarded the plane. We sat in the middle aisle, which had 3 or 4 seats. Next to us on our flight sat this elderly Chinese woman, somewhere above the age of 65, wearing long black and dark clothing. She was very elegantly dressed and had quite an upbeat kind of energy about her. She instantly took to my son and began talking to him in Mandarin, asking my son to give her 5 and things like that. Harmless playing. The flight to Beijing took off, and I spent most of the time talking to the elderly lady sat next to us. We talked about life in America, and she asked me quite a lot of questions about my son. She seemed interested in the cultural differences, and culturally, boys are very popular in China. She helped me look after him during the flight, and even offered to help watch him when I went to the bathroom. When we arrived at Beijing Airport, we both ended up getting the airport link-up subway together. The lady asked me which station I would be getting off at. She told me that she was getting off at that stop too, and that we should go together. She went to make a phone call as I waited for her. Once she came back, we got on the metro together. Things were just like the plane journey, relaxing and some great conversation. When we arrived at our station, we got off the train and headed out towards the turnstiles. I was already thinking about getting a taxi to the train station and what our next steps would be. As we got to the turnstiles, the old lady went through before me. I began trying to get through the turnstiles, but it was quite difficult with the bag and the toddler in my arms. The elderly lady asked me to pass her my son over the turnstiles so that I could get through easier. I told her not to worry and smiled as I began finding my way to fit everything through. When I looked back up, the elderly lady's expression had completely changed. No longer was she smiling. No longer was she some happy-go-lucky old woman. She was now as serious as could be, as she said once more, this time in a far more serious tone, "Pass your son over to me." I looked at her in disbelief and said no. This old woman then let out an incredible scream. One of the loudest screams I've ever heard in my life. So loud that even a busy metro station in one of the most populated cities in the world came to a standstill. I was kind of in shock. I had been talking to this woman for the best part of 8 hours, and here she was screaming her lungs out. What happened next still haunts me, to be honest. The elderly lady then screamed, "That's my baby. My baby. This woman has my grandson and is trying to steal him. Give me my grandson." Then out of nowhere, 2 men in their early 20s came out and started pointing at me and saying, "Yes, that is our little brother. This woman is trying to steal our little brother." The police came running in, and some passers-by tried putting their hands on my son to try and take him away from me. I fell to the floor and laid with my body on top of my son to protect him. People were trying to get me up so they could take my son away from me. I instinctively pulled out my passport and my son's passport and held my son's passport open in the air to prove that I was genuinely his mother. The local police came running in and moved everyone away from me. They checked my documentation and helped me and my son up from the floor. On the other side of the turnstiles, The elderly woman and the two young men were now nowhere to be seen. They had accepted defeat and had left. I kept my son stuck to my side the entire holiday, and I will never forget the moment of panic, where I was literally fighting to hang on to my son. I am very lucky, because things could have been a whole lot different had I not acted the way I did. Boys are very popular in China, and that lady was very likely trying to steal my son so that she could have him for herself or sell him on. I guess when we got to the airport, the phone call she made was to let those two guys know that she had a catch on her hands. Story 2. This story is told from the perspective of a female. I was on a domestic flight. It was a late-night flight going from New York to Michigan. The plane was very full, but fortunately for me, the seat next to me was empty, which was perfect because I like to sleep on planes. I don't know why. There is something I find relaxing about the whole experience. My seat was right at the back of the plane, on the right-hand side. I had a window seat. We were almost about to set off down the runway, while the last few passengers were boarding. With the very last few passengers to board the plane, on walks this grubby-looking creeper, an unwashed guy with big thick glasses and a bobble hat on. His pants were too big for him and were falling down as he walked. All of his clothes were covered in all sorts of different multicolored stains. God knows what those stains were. As he walked down the aisle, I gave a little prayer to every god imaginable that it wouldn't be the seat number next to me, printed on his ticket. He originally walked past my seat, which gave me a brief moment of relief, but of course, it was too good to be true. He then came walking back down, did that classic look of the seat numbers look, and sat right next to me. He didn't say anything to me, which oddly enough actually made the whole experience far creepier. He had this weird dazed look about him, and he took his seat next to me, nervously looking around everywhere. The flight took off, and the lights were turned off shortly afterwards, which was perfect for me. I managed to get some shut-eye, and was sleeping peacefully in my seat, when I was woken up by a red light being shone in my face. I woke up to see the creep next to me, filming me with his camera. I asked him what the F he was doing, and I pushed his camera away from my face. He nervously told me that he was filming the view from outside the window, not me. Yeah, of course. Good luck trying to get me to believe that one. I told him it was nighttime, and he couldn't see anything. Nobody could. He put his camera in his backpack and looked away from me. Shortly afterwards, I was fast asleep again, but in true creeper fashion, that would not be the last time on this flight that I would awake to find a nasty, unwanted surprise. Around half an hour later, I thought I could hear weird sounds and sort of like slapping and groaning sounds. I opened my eyes to see that the guy next to me had his laptop open, with some very violent, weird porn on the screen. The laptop was resting on his lap. He had not only passed out with porn on, he also had his manhood hanging over the top of his stained pants. Fighting back the urge to vomit, I pushed the button on the remote control to call an air hostess. When she eventually arrived, she was mortified and poked the man on his shoulder and demanded he shut his laptop and put his junk away. Needless to say, I didn't fall asleep after that. And when we arrived at Michigan, he was arrested as soon as the plane landed. Story 3. I had spent the year working for a branch of my company in Bogota, Colombia. The company I worked for had asked me if I would be interested in moving to Madrid, Spain, to help out a suffering branch over there. After thinking long and hard about the offer, I eventually accepted, and they sorted out my flights and accommodation for me. The flight was originally Bogota to Caracas, with a 3-hour overlay there, and then a late overnight flight from Caracas to Madrid with Air Europa. The flight from Bogota, Colombia to Caracas, Venezuela, went without a hitch, and I arrived well in time at the airport in Caracas for my connecting flight to Madrid. Sadly, my flight that night was cancelled, and I was swiftly moved to a flight the following night. I phoned my new boss in Madrid to inform him that I would be arriving a day late, which he was very understandable about. After all, what can you do if your flight is cancelled, right? I went to a hotel for the night and got some dinner. The next day I checked out of the hotel late and went back to the airport to catch my international flight to Spain. I arrived quite early at the airport and began walking around and browsing different things. At the airport in Caracas, you have these sort of military national guards that are there to protect the airport. They were walking around the airport, looking for bags to check and asking people at random if they could please come and follow them and have their bags checked. I know that Caracas had been quite a popular route for drug traffickers, and I guess they were just trying to tighten up their security, which I'm all for. As I walked around, checking out the airport's restaurants and shops, 2 members of the National Guard approached me and asked me if I could follow them because they wanted to check my bag. As far as I could understand, it was obligatory, not something that I really had much of a choice about. These 2 members of the National Guard then took me to this small passageway and proceeded to open up my suitcase and ask me a lot of questions, like where I was from, what was I doing, where I was going, if I had any drugs and things that were relative to the scenario. I answered all of their questions and had no trouble doing so. They checked my suitcase rigorously, going through all my clothes and everything. I felt as though they were really looking to find something wrong instead of simply doing their jobs. They were asking me all sorts of questions that were really none of their business. Where did I buy this? Where did I get that? And even personal things like how many women had I been with since I arrived. The whole thing was simply just not professional. After quite a while, they eventually told me I was good to go, and they messily packed my suitcase back up and stamped my wrist with a blue stamp to show that I had already been checked. I still had a good amount of time before check-in started, so I continued walking around the airport, when again, shortly after, 2 other National Guards came over to me and asked me to follow them so that they could check my suitcase. I told them that I'd already had my suitcase checked, and I showed them the blue stamp. They didn't care, and I was forced to go through with it all again. This happened 4 more times after this, and each luggage check just as obnoxious and poorly handled as the last one. I eventually decided to just stay right by the Air Europa check-in desk, and I stayed there and sat on top of my suitcase and read a book. A short while later, I looked up from my book to see that the check-in line had already formed and was now quite long. I picked up my things and joined the line when there was around 3 people left in front of me. I got a tap on my shoulder. It was the National Guard again. This time, instead of 2 of them, there were 6 of them. And they said, "Sorry sir, we need to check your luggage one more time." I begged them not to, and showed them the large array of blue stamps on my wrists from all the previous checks. They said they were sorry, but there was nothing they could do. I followed them to the same hallway where I'd done all the previous luggage checks. But this time, instead of going into the hallway where we had gone before, they took me through the hallway and into this little room and shut the door behind them. 2 of the guards waited outside, and 2 waited inside by the door. One began checking my luggage, and the other one started talking to me in English, talking about sports and things. After a few minutes, I was getting ready to get my bag and go, and finally check in, like I had been trying to do, all night, when the guard that had been talking to me in English came out with, "I'm terribly sorry, sir, but you will not be flying tonight." I asked him why, and he said, "Because you have a lot of cocaine in your suitcase, don't you?" I felt all my muscles tighten, and I wanted to cry. What are you talking about?" I said. "I don't have any cocaine." The guard then said, "I know you don't have any, but I do." He then opened up a small cabinet and showed me a giant bag of white powder, which could have simply been sugar or salt, for all I knew. He then told me that it was my word against his word, and if I wanted to go to Madrid, he would need a present. I didn't want to play around or play any games, so I handed him my wallet, and he took all of my cash out and handed the wallet back to me. They then said I could go and walked me back to the check-in line so that I could check in. I checked in and went through security checks and did not look back. A truly horrifying experience. Story 4. This story is told from the perspective of a female. I used to be a part-time air hostess, but am now a full-time stay-at-home mom. We were welcoming passengers on board one day on an international flight, when in came this group of guys who had been on holiday. They seemed a bit drunk, but not drunk enough for you to know for sure. They could just be arseholes by nature. One of the guys, as they came on the plane, looked at me and said, "I would destroy you," before him and his friends continued walking and went to their seats. I had to go up and down the plane a few times while people were still boarding, to help people with their luggage and seat the passengers. As I walked down the aisle of the plane, this guy started grabbing on my skirt as I walked past, to try and get my attention. He did this a few times and started talking very loudly to his friends about the things he would like to do to me, and in quite a lot of detail. The next time I walked past him, he took it upon himself to grab my skirt again with his hand, this time with more force than the previous attempts. I turned to him. He and his friends were just laughing, and I told him that he would have to behave and stop touching my skirt and stop touching me in general, otherwise I would alert airport authorities and have him removed from the plane. He then said, "Don't alert airport authorities, because I have a bomb for you in my pants." I couldn't believe he just did that. When someone mentions having a bomb, whether it is on a plane or in an airport, even in a lame joke way, you have to alert authorities and they get detained immediately. I stayed calm and called the authorities and told them what had happened. They came onto the plane and arrested the guy, and he and all his friends went into crazy mode and started trying to fight the airport police. Eventually the airport police got the better of them and they were taken away. The man who had been harassing me screamed out some horrible words at me as he was taken out from the plane. Good riddance. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I did making it for you. Let me know in the comments below if you've ever had any scary stories on planes, or what you thought of the video. Remember to give this video a rating, and if you're new, subscribe for more real-life horror.